The carriage from Caddo Wells train station rolled into the Whitmore Ranch yard on a cold gray noon, just as the north wind began sweeping across the prairie like a blunt knife, scraping against the dry ground. Caleb Whitmore stood on the porch, immediately recognizing that this wind was no ordinary wind. But at that moment, he was preoccupied with another annoyance, so he hadn't thought further about it. He did not step out to greet them. He just stood there, one hand holding an old hat, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway, his cold gray eyes watching the woman climb down from the carriage by herself. She did not wait for anyone to help her. Holding a frayed-edged canvas bag in one hand, her other hand tightly grasped the small hand of a girl of about 6 years old. The girl was thin, with big eyes pressing close to her mother's skirt, but not crying. The woman set the bag down on the ground, not dropping it out of exhaustion, but setting it down the way one sets down a part of life they have carried for too long. She raised her head to look at the low wooden house in front of her, looking at the dust-covered windows, the leaning fence, and the men standing around the stable. Then she looked straight at Caleb Whitmore. She did not avert her eyes. Caleb had imagined someone else, perhaps younger, perhaps prettier, perhaps a face that had not been worn down by wind, dust, poverty, and bereavement, to the point where only endurance remained. The woman before him did not look like a bride seeking a new life. She wore a brown dress with patches at the elbows, a collar faded from age, and her chestnut hair neatly pinned under a gray cloth hat. Her face was not beautiful in a way that made men turn to look, but there was something in those eyes that made Caleb uncomfortable. It was too direct, too calm, too much like someone who had been knocked down by life many times, but still refused to stay down. The foreman, Silas Crow, leaned against the stable fence, spat on the ground, and sneered. "Is this the person you ordered through a mail-order bride letter, boss?" he said loudly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I thought you were looking for a wife. Turns out you found another tired widow with a little shadow attached." Two young cowboys burst out laughing. The laughter was short, dry, and died instantly when the woman turned to look at them. She didn't blush, didn't bow her head, didn't argue back. She simply said, her voice not loud but clear enough, "My name is Eliza Monroe, and this is my daughter, Lily." Caleb stepped down one porch step. "In the letter, you said you had a daughter. I wrote it very clearly. Perhaps I didn't read it carefully." "Yes," Eliza replied. "Perhaps so." That statement was as light as dust, but fell onto the dirt yard as heavy as stone. Caleb pursed his lips. He didn't like the feeling of being reminded that he was wrong, much less when the person reminding him was a strange woman who had just stepped into his yard with an old bag and a child not in the plans. Because he had sent a letter looking for a housekeeper, someone to cook for the cowboy crew, and make this house less cold like an abandoned warehouse. He wasn't looking for a new family, wasn't looking for a child, even less so someone who could touch the void left by his deceased wife. Margaret had been dead for 2 winters. From that day on, the Whitmore house was only a place where men ate hurriedly, slept hurriedly, and then went back out to the prairie. The kitchen was cold. The living room was covered in dust. The flower beds in front of the porch were dead and dry. Margaret's sewing chair still sat by the window, upon which remained a thread basket, an unfinished roll of fabric, and a wooden comb with a few pale blonde hairs caught in it. Caleb didn't let anyone touch them, not because he knew how to preserve them, but because he lacked the courage to put them away. He looked at Eliza for a moment longer, then said as if wanting to close the matter, "The carriage will return to the station on Monday morning. You can stay here until then. After that, if you want to leave, I will pay your fare." Eliza looked down at Lily. The little girl was observing the one-eyed dog lying next to the woodpile. The old dog looked back with its one remaining eye, neither barking nor wagging its tail. Then she looked back at Caleb. "I will cook dinner tonight," she said. Then you decide if I am worth staying past Monday." Without waiting to be invited, she picked up her bag and led her child into the house. The kitchen was worse than she had imagined. Old ash filled the stove. The countertops were coated with a layer of black grease. The sink was dry and cracked. On the floor, dust, breadcrumbs, onion skins, and muddy footprints piled up like seasons of failure. Hanging on a hook by the door was an old apron of the recently deceased cook, stained with flour and kitchen smoke. Caleb stood at the threshold, his voice hoarse. "My wife used to keep this place cleaner." Eliza didn't turn around. "I believe so." She looked at the sewing basket by the window, looking at Margaret's wooden comb. She did not touch it, did not ask, did not pity. She just quietly rolled up her sleeves. In her life she had cleaned worse kitchens than this. A kitchen in a railroad camp after a rain turned the dirt into mud. A kitchen in a canvas tent where men with high fevers lay groaning outside. Kitchens of places where no one thought a woman could last more than 3 days. Eliza Monroe had lasted much longer than 3 days. She found a broom, found soap, found dry wood. She started a fire. She scrubbed the table until the wood emerged beneath the old oil layer, washed the pots and pans, swept the ashes, wiped the stove, and hung a clean towel on the hook. Lily didn't need her mother to tell her. She picked up the tin cups herself, wiping each one with the edge of a small cloth. The two of them worked side by side, silently, as if accustomed to starting over from a strange kitchen. By afternoon, the smell of stewed beans and salted meat began to spread throughout the house. There was cornbread baking in a cast-iron skillet, freshly brewed coffee that wasn't bitter and burnt like the usual liquid the cowboys drank, roasted onions, hot fat, and warmth. When the cowboys returned from the prairie, they walked in with the expressions of people waiting to witness a joke. Silas Crow sat down at the head of the table, leaning his chair back. "Let's see what the widow from the east can cook." Eliza scooped food for each person. She didn't say much. Lily walked behind, placing a piece of cornbread on each plate, her small hands careful, as if doing a very important job. The men took their first bite. The room gradually grew quiet, not a silence of contempt, but a strange kind of silence, when people do not want to admit they were just surprised. Jonah Briggs, the oldest cowboy on the ranch, slowly broke a piece of cornbread, dipped it into the bean broth, and ate. He chewed for a long time, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you learn to cook, Mrs. Monroe?" "Kansas," Eliza replied. "Railroad camp." Jonah looked at her a little longer, as if a door in his memory had just cracked open, but wasn't wide enough to see what was inside. He didn't say anything else, but that look lingered. Silas finished his plate, but still wouldn't keep quiet. "One pot of beans doesn't prove anything," he said. "Cooking for 5 people in the house is different from cooking for the whole crew working out in the field. When the cold storm hits, you will know what is real." Eliza poured more coffee into his cup. "Then you just live long enough to eat the next meal, Mr. Crow." A young cowboy almost choked. Silas looked up, and for a moment the room tensed, but Eliza had already turned away, as if she hadn't said anything significant. Caleb stood outside the door, watching everything. He didn't want to admit that this kitchen was different tonight. Didn't want to admit the smell of hot bread made the house less like a tomb. Didn't want to admit that the child, when placing the coffee cup next to his hand, had made his throat choke up, because he remembered Margaret used to do the exact same thing. That night, Lily brought a cup of coffee to the porch for Caleb. She set it down next to his boots. "Mother said you should drink it while it's hot." "Aren't you afraid of me?" Lily thought for a moment. "A little." "Then why did you bring the coffee?" "Because Mother said people who are too cold often find it hard to be kind." After saying that, the little girl turned back into the house. Caleb sat for a long time with the coffee cup in his hand, letting the heat radiate onto his face. He didn't drink right away. He looked out over the dark prairie where the wind was changing direction, and at this moment the unpleasant joke from noon had receded, giving way to what he had tried not to think about all day. Anyone who has lived long on the Caprock region knows the smell of a blizzard before seeing it. Caleb smelled it in the wind that night, and he knew the coming days would spare no one. That night the wind poured down from the north. By morning the sky was low and gray like a dirty blanket. Temperatures dropped by the hour. The dry grass lay flat. The uneasy horses stomped their hooves in the stable. At noon, a horseback rider galloped back to deliver the news. The main crew was nearly a day's ride from the ranch, gathering over 1,000 heads of cattle to get them to the station before the debt was due. If he didn't deliver the cattle this week, Caleb would lose the contract. Losing the contract meant losing the money to pay the bank. Losing the bank payment meant the Whitmore Ranch would fall into the hands of Victor Harlan, the wealthy landowner who had waited many years to swallow up this whole area. And bad news doesn't come alone. The cook Caleb had hired from town had changed his mind. Taking a job for another wagon train with higher pay, 16 men would return in the storm, freezing and starving, and there was no one to cook for them. Evening fell early. Caleb stood in the hallway, listening to the wind howling through the roof. He knew well what a hungry, freezing, exhausted cowboy crew would become. They might quit, might curse right in his face, might ruin the entire final cattle drive season, and then, with almost no other options left, he remembered Silas's own challenge. From the night before, when the cold storm hits, you will know what is real. The storm had indeed hit. He walked into the kitchen. Eliza was sitting by the oil lamp, mending the hem of Lily's dress. The girl was sleeping on a blanket near the fireplace. The one-eyed dog curled up beside her. That dog had not lain near anyone since the day Margaret died. Caleb looked at that scene and felt his heart grow uncomfortable over a warmth that wasn't allowed to appear. He cleared his throat. "Can you cook for the whole crew?" Eliza set the needle down. "How many people?" 16. Maybe more. They'll be back around noon tomorrow, if they don't freeze to death on the way. What's left in the pantry? Flour, beans, coffee, sugar, dried apples, a little salted meat, one side of beef hanging in the back house, and one calf that can be butchered. Eliza stood up, took down the old apron from the hook, and tied it over the one she was wearing. "I need someone to butcher the calf tonight. I need 2 people to chop wood until midnight. I need barrels full of water, and from now until morning no one is allowed to stand in the kitchen and get in my way." "Are you sure?" "No," Eliza said. "But I have cooked for 40 people in the snow, in the mud, and in the fever epidemic. 16 people will only make my hands a little busier." That was the first time Caleb heard her mention her past. He didn't ask further, but he called the calf butcher, ordered 2 young men to chop wood, and carried the first buckets of water into the kitchen himself. Throughout that night, Eliza did not sleep. She stoked the large oven, revived the deceased cook's old sourdough starter, kneaded dough, proofed dough, stewed beans, cut meat, simmered hearts, livers, marrow, and the parts others usually threw away into a spicy, pungent stew. She found a bag of dried chili peppers and some molasses in the pantry. She cooked dried apples with sugar, covered them with pie crust, and placed them in a cast-iron pot buried in the coals to make a hot apple pie. The wind roared outside the door. The windows fogged up with steam, and the pots boiled and bubbled like a rough orchestra of life. Lily woke up at midnight, rubbing her eyes. "Do you need me to help?" "Go back to sleep. I can wipe the cups." Eliza looked at her daughter, then nodded. So the little girl sat by the table, wiping each tin cup in the firelight, while the old dog rested its snout on her leg. By near dawn, Eliza had finished baking 48 small loaves of bread. She wrapped them in cloth, keeping them warm in the hot sandbox next to the stove. The stew was thick, the smell of beef, chili, and mesquite smoke spreading all the way to the stable. Black coffee boiled over the fire. The apple pies cracked open on top, the dark amber molasses bubbling up. As the sky turned from black to gray, Eliza washed her face with cold water, tied her hair back, and put on the clean apron on the outside. She stood by the window, her red raw hands cradling a cup of coffee, watching the storm whip across the prairie. "It's time," she said softly. They returned in the storm like ghosts. 16 men slumped low on their saddles, their coats frozen at the shoulders, their beards covered in snow, their eyes red from the wind. Their horses shivered violently. The cattle had been herded into the eastern fenced pasture, but the crew was nearly exhausted. From a distance, a man named Tommy Vale raised his face. "Do you guys smell that?" No one answered, but they all smelled it. The smell of hot food pierced through the wind and snow, so strong that it seemed as if it were pulling them home. When the men walked into the kitchen, they stopped at the threshold. The fire blazed brightly in the oven. The long table was already set. Hot bread was piled high on plates. The stew was steaming. The coffee was boiling. The apple pie was placed next to the stove, the heat radiating off it like mist. Eliza stood by the oven, Lily beside her, holding a towel in her hands. "Come in," Eliza said. "The food is still hot. There is enough for everyone." No one laughed. Jonah Briggs was the first to take off his hat, then the second person, then the third. Finally, all 16 men stood in the warm kitchen, hats in hand, heads bowed before a woman, whom 2 days ago they thought wouldn't last a single week. They ate in silence. No one said a word for the first 10 minutes. There was only the sound of spoons clinking against tin plates, the sound of wood popping in the oven, the howling of the wind outside the roof, and the very soft sighs of men who had been cold for too long, finally being warmed from the inside. Silas Crow finished one entire plate, then a second plate. He held out his plate without looking at Eliza. She scooped more for him, saying nothing. It was that silence that made Silas more uncomfortable than any sarcasm. The words he had said the other day were still there, sitting in the middle of the room like a stray dog caught stealing food. As the meal was nearing its end, Jonah Briggs set his cup down very slowly. The door in his memory, cracked open from the night before, was now fully open. He looked at Eliza, his old eyes clouded by wind and dust suddenly brightening. "I know you." The whole table looked up. Eliza stood still. "It took me 2 days to remember," Jonah continued. "Kansas Pacific, spring of '81. The stone-cutting camp by the Saline River. The fever epidemic swept through the camp. The cook died first, the workers died after. There was only one woman standing in the kitchen day and night, cooking porridge, baking bread, spoon-feeding men who had no strength left to sit up." Eliza clenched her hands into the edge of her apron. Jonah looked around the room. "You folks here don't know, but along the railroad line that year, people said if you could still crawl to Mrs. Monroe's kitchen tent, you still had a chance to live. No one touched their utensils anymore." Eliza lowered her eyes. "My husband died in that camp," she said. "Samuel Monroe. 9 days after the fever. I stayed because they still needed to eat." Her voice didn't break, but Lily stepped closer to her mother, grabbing her hand. Jonah took off his hat again, even though it was already on the table. "Then this ranch is luckier than it deserves to be." He turned to Silas. "Right, Crow?" Silas looked down at his empty plate. His face flushed red, unclear whether from the fire or from shame. "Right," he said quietly. "That's right." The storm lasted 3 days. During those 3 days, no one could go out to the field. Cattle crowded together against the fences. Horses stood shivering in the stable. Snow blanketed the roofs white, and the wind whipped against the windows as if trying to tear the whole ranch apart. Eliza cooked 3 meals a day for the whole crew: bread, cornmeal mush, stew, beans, potatoes, coffee, apple pie, and hot soup. She turned the meager supplies in the pantry into enough food to make the men curse less and begin to learn how to say thank you. Every meal melted away a little more of the ice between her and the men around the table. By the morning of the 3rd day, Silas Crow walked into the kitchen as Eliza was hauling water up from the well. He walked over, didn't say anything, and lifted the carrying pole off her shoulders. "I can do it myself," Eliza said. "I know." He carried the water into the kitchen, setting it down next to the oven. Then he stood there, his hat pressed against his chest, looking as miserable as someone forced to read a book in church. "I said a lowly thing about you the day you arrived," he said. "Said it in front of the whole crew. I want to take it back." Eliza looked at him for a moment. Then she took out from behind the stove a plate of food that had been kept warm: bread, stew, and a thick slice of apple pie. "I knew you would come," she said. Silas was stunned. "You knew?" A full man often finds his conscience more easily. He bowed his head to accept the plate. "Thank you, Mrs. Monroe." "Eat it, Mr. Crow. Let's consider us even." But the storm hadn't taken everything it wanted yet. That afternoon, when the weather temporarily subsided, Lily discovered the one-eyed dog was missing. It was old but stubborn. Perhaps it had squeezed through a gap in the fence to chase after some scent outside the stable. The little girl didn't tell anyone. Wearing her small scarf, she sneaked out to find it, because to Lily, that dog was her first friend in this strange place. When Eliza realized Lily was no longer in the kitchen, the wind had picked up strongly again. She ran out onto the porch, calling her child's name. There was no answer. Caleb heard her voice and rushed out from the stable. "What's wrong?" "Lily is gone." Those 3 words alone turned Caleb's face stark white. He didn't think. He grabbed a rope, a hurricane lamp, and plunged into the snow. Eliza ran after him, but the wind knocked her off balance. Caleb turned around and yelled, "Get in the house! She is my child, and I will bring her back." That was not the promise of a ranch boss. That was the roar of a man who had just discovered his heart still had something to lose. Caleb found Lily near the northern fence. The little girl lay curled up under a mesquite bush, her 2 arms tightly hugging the old dog. The dog's leg was caught in some wire, and Lily, trying to untangle it, had been battered by the wind to the point of exhaustion. He knelt down. "Lily!" The girl half opened her eyes. "I found him, Mr. Whitmore." Caleb took off his coat and wrapped it around the girl and the dog, held them both to his chest, and stood up. On the way back, the wind pushed him into stumbling. At one point, he fell to one knee, snow slipping down his collar, cold as a knife. But he did not let go. When Caleb stepped into the kitchen, Eliza rushed over to receive her child. Lily was freezing cold but still breathing. Eliza hugged her child close to her body, shivering so much she couldn't stand steadily. Caleb was also shivering, his hair and beard covered in white snow, his hands bleeding from untangling the wire from the dog's leg. Eliza looked at him. In her eyes there was fear, gratitude, and something else yet to be named. "Thank you," she said. Caleb couldn't answer. He just looked at Lily being held by her mother by the oven, looked at the old dog lying wheezing at their feet, and felt the wall inside his heart collapse by another large chunk. After the storm, the ranch entered its most grueling days of work. The cattle had to be delivered to the station before the deadline. The roads were muddy. The weather was cold. The men were tired, and the horses were weak. Caleb hardly slept. If they were late on the contract, Victor Harlan would take the land. If they lost the land, everyone here would be scattered. The storm had passed, but its price still had to be paid with grueling days. Eliza was not just in the kitchen. She took the chuck wagon out into the field, cooking amidst the wind, dust, and frozen mud. By noon, when the cowboys were exhausted, they would hear her voice calling from the chuck wagon and immediately head back like children hearing the school bell. Gradually, the men changed. They brought firewood to her themselves, washed their own plates, and didn't swear near Lily. The young guy, Tommy Vale, bought a red ribbon in town and awkwardly gave it to the little girl, his ears redder than the ribbon. "For you," he said. Because the dog likes red." Lily smiled for the first time since coming to the ranch. Caleb saw that smile and had to turn away. There are things so tender that they hurt people, more than wounds. One evening near the end of the cattle drive, Caleb saw Lily fall asleep in the back of the chuck wagon, the one-eyed dog lying next to her. Cold wind blew through the floorboards. He stood watching for a long time, then took off his coat and draped it over her. Lily woke up groggily. "Thank you, Father." She paused mid-sleep, as if she herself didn't know what she had just said. Caleb stood frozen. Lily went back to sleep, the old dog breathing steadily. But Caleb still stood there in the darkness, without a coat, letting the cold wind cut through his shirt without feeling the chill. Just one word. Father. It hit him harder than every storm in the Caprock region. The cattle herd finally arrived at the station on time. The contract was kept. The bank was paid. The Whitmore Ranch survived. The ranch that should have dissolved into Victor Harlan's hands still stood, largely thanks to a kitchen that never let its fire go out. That night, when everyone was asleep, Caleb returned home and saw Eliza in the kitchen. She was kneading dough for the next morning, her two hands white with flour up to the wrists. The oil lamp hung high above, its yellow light coating her hair. Lily was sleeping in the side room, the old dog lying across the doorway like a guard. Caleb stood at the threshold, just like the first day, but he was no longer the man of the first day. "Eliza." She turned around, her hands still resting in the soft dough. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore?" "Caleb," he said. "Call me Caleb." She remained silent. He walked in, his hands twirling his old hat. "I wrote a letter looking for a housekeeper, a cook. I thought that was all I needed because I had told myself I didn't need anything else since the day Margaret died." Eliza quietly pulled her hands out of the dough. Caleb continued, his voice hoarse. "When you stepped down from the carriage with Lily, I thought you were a burden. I thought wrong. You didn't make this house noisy. You brought it back to life. You didn't just feed my men. You kept them here. You kept this ranch standing. And you—" He paused for a long time. "You make me want to be a better man than the one who stood on the porch the day you arrived." Eliza wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at him with eyes that had seen through too much loss to easily believe in beautiful things. "Caleb, I once had a good husband. I know. I will not pretend Samuel never existed. I am not asking you to do that. I also won't step into this house by pushing Margaret out of it." Caleb looked toward the sewing basket placed next to the window. "You have never touched her things. Because the dead need to be respected too. I understand that." Caleb nodded. His eyes reddened, but he didn't cry. "Eliza, I am not asking you because I need a cook. I am not asking because I need a mother for Lily. Though God knows the girl walked right into my heart without asking for permission. I am asking because if one day you leave here, this house will be colder than before you came." He took another step. "Can you stay? Not as a hired hand, not as someone I send train money to exchange for, but as yourself. Eliza Monroe, the woman who stepped into my cold kitchen and lit the fire." Eliza bowed her head. She had traveled too many roads to get here, had buried Samuel under the hard Kansas dirt, had cooked for dying men, had lived on every loose coin, every meal traded for a place to sleep, every day not daring to want anything but for her daughter to be alive by tomorrow morning. She once thought just being hired was a blessing. Now, There was a man standing before her, making no flowery promises, not getting down on one knee like in the books, just awkwardly offering her the thing she dared not hope for, a home where she was wanted to stay. "I will stay," she said. Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment. "But not because I have nowhere else to go," Eliza continued. "I am staying because this is the first place in years I want to call home." Caleb reached out his hand. She placed her two flower-covered hands into his. Outside, the snow began to fall lightly, not fiercely like the previous storm, but soft and quiet. It blanketed the stable roof, the fences, and the long road leading south. In the kitchen, the bread was rising slowly on the stove, the coffee was still warm, and the oil lamp burned yellow by the window. They married 2 weeks before Christmas in a small back room of the Caddo Wells Church. Mrs. Eleanor Pike, who had helped send the first letter, cried her handkerchief wet. Jonah Briggs wore a stiff-collared shirt, standing as a witness with the solemnity of someone attending a king's coronation. Silas Crow sat in the second row, hat pressed to his chest, eyes looking down at the floor. Tommy Vale sneakily gave Lily another blue ribbon. The one-eyed dog lay outside the carriage, guarding the wedding cake as if it were its final mission in life. The town had laughed that Caleb Whitmore had sent a mail-order bride letter and received a poor widow with a fatherless child. But after the wedding reception, when they ate Eliza's cake, drank Eliza's coffee, and saw the way the Whitmore cowboys stood around her, like standing around a fire in the middle of winter, they didn't laugh as loudly as before. When spring came, Eliza replanted the flower beds in front of the porch. She placed Margaret's sewing basket on a clean shelf where the sunlight could touch it. The wooden comb was wrapped in soft cloth, put away carefully so that one day, when Lily was old enough to understand, she would know this house had been loved by another woman before she and her mother arrived. Eliza didn't believe the living needed to erase the dead to have a place to stand. She only believed a home was wide enough for both memories and tomorrow. Whitmore Ranch gradually became the warmest place in the Caprock region, not because the walls were thicker, not because there were fewer storms, but because there was always a light in the kitchen window. There was always hot coffee on the stove, and any rider lost in the north wind. If they could still see that yellow speck of light in the dark prairie, knew they hadn't been abandoned yet. Silas Crow never called Eliza the tired widow again. Jonah Briggs still told anyone who would listen that he had eaten her bread since the railroad days, and knew from the start this ranch had gotten lucky. Tommy Vale still got red ears many years later, whenever Lily mentioned that first ribbon. As for Caleb, every morning before heading out to the field, he stopped at the kitchen door, longer than necessary. Eliza would often ask, "Did you forget something?" He would reply, "No, just wanted to look at the fire for a bit." But they both knew he wasn't just looking at the fire. He was looking at the woman who had arrived on a dusty, windy day, set her old bag down in the yard, and endured contempt without bowing her head. The person who hadn't argued to be respected, but just quietly worked until a whole room of men took off their hats before her. The person who had brought along a child, a painful past, a pair of red, calloused hands, and a heart that refused to go out. Eliza Monroe Whitmore didn't change to become worthy. She had been worthy all along. What changed was that someone finally knew how to see. And on winter nights, when the north wind poured down again, rattling the windows, flattening the dry grass, and making the horses neigh loudly in the stable, the Whitmore kitchen was still brightly lit. On the stove, bread was rising. In the pot, there was hot coffee. Lily slept peacefully in the small room, the old dog lying by the door. Caleb sat at the wooden table, quietly peeling an apple for his wife, and Eliza stood by the stove, listening to the wind howling outside, listening to the fire crackling inside, and understood that after all the cold roads she had traveled, she finally no longer had to cook to survive. She cooked for a home, and that home, after so many freezing years, had finally learned how to keep the fire.